Welcome. My name is Paolo Annino, and I teach at Florida State University College of Law. I'm honored to be here today, and I'm talking about one of my favorite topics, developmental disability waiver. This is a very exciting period. Just last week, our special session ended, and this is one of the few times during this legislative session, really, children with developmental disabilities have received a great opportunity. And that is, the legislature and the governor has come up with enough money to take roughly 2,000 folks off the 20,000 wait list for Medicaid waivers. And these people who are on the wait list have all been found eligible. They all have been found to have a developmental disability. And they all been found to have medically necessary these services. So they've all been found to have a developmental disability. Now, in Florida, what we've done is we have 6 developmental disabilities. The legislature has decided of all these different conditions out there, they have listed 6 as developmental disabilities under Florida Statute 393. The 6 developmental disabilities are: 1, autism. And autism is a neurological disorder that is shown by language issues and also by behavioral social issues. Okay? Neurological disorder that impacts both language and socialization. The second developmental disability Florida has designated is what we call intellectual disability. Intellectual disability is what used to be called mental retardation. What used to be called mental retardation. We call it intellectual disability. And in Florida, we have some very specific definition what a intellectual disability is. It's a disability with an IQ that's 70 or less, and with deficits in adaptive behavior. And we'll talk about that in a little while. So we have 6 developmental disabilities in Florida, and that's it. We have 6. So the third one is Spina Bifida. Spina Bifida. Spina Bifida is a birth defect where the spine is incomplete. It's somehow incomplete or split. Spina Bifida. It's a birth defect. Fourth, we have a disorder called Prader-Willi syndrome. Prader-Willi syndrome. Again, that is a genetic disorder. Many times with Prader-Willi kids, they cannot control what they eat and have obesity and fatal obesity, but a variety of other conditions. Prader-Willi. Fifth is Down syndrome. Down syndrome, and that is the chromosome, incomplete chromosome, extra chromosome. So Down syndrome, and then see what am I missing here? Autism, intellectual disability, spina bifida, Prader-Willi, Down syndrome, and there is one more, and that is very basic too. I'm sorry about that. Cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is a neurological disorder that impacts movement. Impacts movement. And so in a variety of different ways. And it's sometimes genetic, sometimes it's environmental. But it's a neurological disorder that impacts movement. So these are the 6. So when we talk about 20,000 people on the wait list, the 20,000 people have been, the Agency for Persons with Disabilities have said that they qualify, they do have this disability, they qualify for a Medicaid waiver, and they're waiting. And we know at least they wait minimum, and the data, to my knowledge, is not out there, but they're waiting at least 5 years, to get off the wait list, the 20,000 per wait list, to actually get the habilitation services we talked about in our first 2 segments. Okay, so these are our 6 under Florida Statute 393. Let me talk about one of them, just so we give an example. How do you prove these developmental disabilities? Again, most of these developmental disabilities here, these 6, you're going to prove it based on medical records. I mean, whether or not a child has cerebral palsy is not really subjective. And same thing with Prader-Willi or Down syndrome. That's not subjective. These are scientifically established. So most then will be a medical diagnosis that's going to establish that whether or not you meet the Florida Statute 393. But some are more difficult, more complex, and that's an example of the intellectual disability. As I already mentioned, for an intellectual disability, it's a two-prong test. One is, it depends on aptitude. And aptitude, what we mean by aptitude, we mean innate ability, innate gift, innate talent. Something that you don't create, something that you don't learn. So the opposite of an aptitude test is an achievement test. An achievement test is something that you've worked really hard and you produce these results based on your hard work. Aptitude is, captures your innate ability. And there's a number of different aptitude tests we use in this country. We use the Wechsler, we use the Stanford-Binet, and matter of fact, in the Florida Administrative Code, under Chapter 393 in the Florida Administrative Code, the agency designates a variety of aptitude tests which are presumptively reliable. So part of it then is the way for intellectual disability, you have to have an aptitude test that shows an IQ of 70 or less, and then you're going to have the second part is you're going to have to show deficits in adaptive behavior. How do you do that? Again, by fact witness, yes, but also by different psychological instruments. The tool that's most common, again, there's a list that APD provides of different tools to measure adaptive behavior, and one is called the Vineland. The Vineland, that's very common. And what the Vineland is a test that that's like a battery of questions. So they figure out, based on these battery of questions, they determine what the child's deficits are in certain realms of behavior. So personal hygiene, for example, safety is another example. So based on these tests, that's how intellectual disabilities are determined. Now, as I said, the statute is clear what's required, 2 standard deviations from the norm. Let me explain what that means a little bit for an aptitude test. So the way aptitude test works is there's a norm, there's a mean. The mean is, so half the people are above the mean, half the people below the mean. The mean for aptitude tests generally is 100. And then 2 standard deviations, that's what the statute says. Well, a deviation is 15 points. 2 standard deviations is 30 points. So you subtract 30 from 100. So that means in order to have an intellectual disability, you have to have a score of, in an aptitude test, of 70 or less. Now, then in addition to that, you'd have to have, by statute, you're required to have deficits in adaptive behavior. There is a handbook, November 2000 handbook, dealing with the developmental disability waiver, and that handbook slightly differs in the actual test, but the statutory test is what I said, 2 standard deviations from the mean, and deficits in adaptive behavior. Okay, so that is what these are the 6 developmental disabilities that everyone in the 20,000 person wait list have one of these 6 developmental disabilities, and I gave the example of how you achieve it with intellectual disability. Next thing I want to talk about now is the 2 ways of getting off the wait list. How do you get off the 20,000 person wait list and actually get and receive the habilitation services that are medically necessary for the child and young adult to live in the community? As I was saying, there are 2 ways of getting off this 20,000 person wait list. And the 2 ways are what I call based on the priority statute, and that's 393.0653. 393.0653. The priority stat, oh, I'm sorry, I messed that up there, I apologize there. 5. Okay, the priority statute, and what that is, it's a statute that spells out what priority Agency for Persons with Disabilities has to, in taking these people off the wait list. Who to give priority to, who should get off the wait list first. And what Agency for Persons with Disabilities has done is they have 7, they've listed 7 categories. When I say they, I should say the legislature. The legislature has listed 7 categories of priority. 7 categories. And I won't go through all 7 categories in 393.065, parentheses 5. And the reason why I'm not going to go through all the 7 categories is, for all practical purposes, no one gets off the list if you're not in category 1 or in category 2. So those are the 2 most important, at least for our purposes, which is children in the foster care system. Okay, so what is category 1? So that's the category that the legislature has decided that this population group of the 20,000 should get first priority. And that is adults and children who are in crisis. Who are in crisis. So those adults and children of the 20,000 who are in crisis should get the first priority to get off the wait list and to actually receive the habilitation services they need and are medically necessary for that. So that's the first. So the first category is crisis. The second category is children in the foster care system. That's why we're here today. So they are given second priority in getting off the wait list. So I'm going to call them DCF kids. Kids in the foster care system. Okay, so those are the 2 priorities. Even though there's 7 categories, I'm only going to talk about the first 2 categories because these are the most important for our purposes. That's crisis, first priority to get off the wait list, and the second if the child is a DCF child. Okay, so what is crisis? Right? That's what is that subjective? What is crisis? Well, again, it's spelled out. Crisis is spelled out. So there is three priorities or three ways of looking at crisis. One way of looking at it, 3 ways. Okay. The first priority, and that's the language, priority. The first priority for crisis is homeless. Homeless. So if a child or an adult is on the wait list and is homeless, and if they can establish they're homeless, then they will be deemed in crisis. So the first priority of crisis by regulation is homelessness. And I want to maybe spend a minute with that. It's very important if you are going to try to establish crisis based on homelessness that you really document the homelessness. And how would you document the homelessness? Well, what documents would you need? What evidence would you need? A letter from the guardian ad litem, a letter from the community-based care agency, a letter or an affidavit from the homeless shelter, an arrest that the person's sleeping on a park bench, a letter from a friend that says that he's allowing the person to sleep on their couch temporarily. You need to prove the intensity of homelessness. You need to prove the consequences of homelessness. You need to prove how often the person's homeless. So the first priority we're going to talk about is homeless in order to establish crisis. The second priority is, as part of crisis, is what I call danger to yourself or others. Or others. I think the actual language is injury to yourself or others, but I always call it danger to yourself or others. So that is, again, someone on the wait list and they're cutting themselves, for example, self-mutilation. And again, what you're going to have to show is not just the frequency of the cutting themselves, the intensity, and also, are they stabbing themselves 3 inches or are they just scratching themselves? All those extent need to be shown when you're trying to prove crisis. So the second priority for crisis is danger to yourself or others. And the third priority for crisis is your present caretaker. Say it's your father. Your present caretaker can no longer take care of you. Your parent dies. The parent dies. So the caretaker can no longer take care of you, and your caretaker no longer can take care of you. For whatever reason, they no longer can take care of you. They're absent. So it's an emergency. That's really when we talk about crisis. We're really talking, emphasizing almost an emergency for all 3 of these priorities. So homelessness, danger to yourself or others, and no longer, the caretaker can no longer take care of you. That's the third priority. So what do you do? The first way I said was crisis, the statutory way through crisis. Well, you create a binder, and in the binder, I do an index, and in the binder, you decide which of these 3 you're going to apply for. Excuse me for a moment. So you're going to decide which of the 3 you're going to apply for. So you'll do a tab and an index with all your documentation that establishes either homelessness, danger to yourself or others, or a caretaker no longer can take care of the person with developmental disabilities. You might have Baker Act reports, you might have police arrest records, you might have affidavits in this packet, and you submit this packet with a cover letter to where? To the local APD office. You submit it to the local APD office. And again, whether or not you prevail on your crisis application to the local APD office will depend on, can you really establish that the child or adult meets one of these priorities, and can you establish intensity, frequency, and the extent. And you do that again through documentation of a variety of types. what happens if you get denied? You have a right to an administrative hearing. And as we talked in the last session, last segment, it's a hearing before a fair hearing officer. Fair hearing officer. And it's not a DOA hearing. It's not a hearing before the Department of Administrative Hearings. Yeah, fair hearing officer hearings are conducted by Department of Children and Family Services, and they use the fair hearing rules under the Florida Administrative Code. So you have a right to a full hearing. Again, your witnesses for this type of hearing are going to be the guardian ad litems. It's going to be guardian ad litems is going to be the community-based care workers. It's going to be perhaps a psychologist. It's going to be folks who can establish that the child fits into one of these categories, these priorities, and not only fit, but talk about intensity. There has to be conversations about intensity. So that's the first way of establishing crisis and trying to get off the wait list is through the application stage and then through the administrative hearing stage to prove by a preponderance of evidence that the child meets one of these three categories. In the past, one of the major problems has been this, that an advocate would prove that Josie, for example, is homeless, and that she's been living on the park bench for the last 8 months, and that she's been getting arrested, and you have police reports, and that she's been being brutalized while sleeping on the park bench. So you were able to prove all that, but then the agency would say, okay, but we don't have the funding, and therefore we're not going to find crisis. And as we're going to talk about in a minute, that argument no longer exists, at least for this year here. And we'll talk about why that is so. So the next way then we're going to talk about how to get off the wait list is not through the statutory method, 393.065, but is through something very different. And many of you who went to law school might remember this from your Florida constitutional law classes. Is there's only one bill the Florida legislature has to pass each year. Only one bill. And that bill is the appropriation bill. Right? There's only one bill that the Florida legislature has to pass every year, and that's the appropriation bill. And the second thing you probably should have learned in your constitutional law class, Florida constitutional law, is the Appropriation Act is only good for 1 year. It's only good for 1 year. So it's unlike other statutes. Other statutes continue until repealed, I should say, or amended, but not Appropriation Act. The Appropriation Act after July 1st, or after July, it ends, and a new Appropriation Act applies. Okay? So the second way of getting off the wait list has to do with the Appropriation Act. And specifically, what I'm talking about is chapter, make sure I get this right. Yeah, chapter 2015, 222. Right. Chapter 2015, 222, section 20. So, in the Appropriation Act, chapter 2015-222, section 20, has something called proviso language. Proviso language. Proviso language is language that's used in the appropriation bill, used in the Appropriation Act. And usually when you think of an Appropriation Act, you think it's only a bunch of numbers, a series of numbers. But in fact, there is language in there and talking about how different funding is going to be used. And what we have now under the proviso language is an incredible opportunity. Again, I want to thank the governor and the legislature for giving us this opportunity. It is allowing most, if not most, many foster care children to get off the wait list this year. Again, it has to happen this year because the appropriation language only is good for 1 year. And so what Chapter 2015-222 says is, uses the language, shall be offered a slot. Shall be offered a slot. Mandatory. So who will receive this mandatory shall be offered a slot? Well, anyone in crisis. So if you can establish crisis this year, either for an adult or a child, no longer is there a defense, we don't have the money. Shall be offered a slot. So the legislature is funding every case that has been deemed a crisis. So that is major, right there. So as long as there's deemed a crisis, there's the funding, and the person will get off the 20,000 person wait list. But now is what I really think is the really exciting part of this. All these different ways DCF kids, remember here we said category 2, right? Category 2 was the DCF kids. All the different ways DCF kids can get off the wait list that are in the Appropriation Act. Well, let me name the ways. First, any child in the foster care system that's transitioning, need another one? Any child that's transitioning, and now, wait a minute, any child in the foster care system that's transitioning, really, every child in the foster care system should be transitioning, right? So the first part of the requirement, transitioning, should not be a problem, because all our kids should be transitioning if you're in the foster care system. Transitioning toward what? Toward permanency, right? So the first element is transitioning to something called finalization. So they're transitioning to finalization, and finalization means a process. It means not the end, it's like going to the end, and even after the end, it's a process. It's a process when we talk about finalization. So DCF kids who are transitioning to finalization for, here it goes, the first one, adoption. So if any of the 20,000, any of the 20,000 folks on the wait list are kids who are in DCF and they're transitioning to a finalization of adoption, they shall be offered a slot. They'll be able to get off the wait list. They'll be offered a slot. Okay? So this is going to be very helpful. Now, again, the key elements are transitioning and finalization of adoption. You know, it has to be realistic. Meaning you can't just imagine, well, maybe this kid is going to be adopted. No, that doesn't get you off the wait list. You have to have, it has to be realistic that the child is going to be adopted. How do you make it realistic? Well, I think by having a home study, for example, an approved home study, that makes it realistic. Having a judicial review that shows that there's language in the judicial review that you are getting to finalization. It's getting close to adoption. So one way then is all these kids who are transitioning to adoption, where it's getting close to the adoption, they then can receive, if they're on the wait list, they can get off the wait list. and receive their Medicaid waiver. Next group. Kids who are transitioning to finalization of reunification. 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 So if you have kids who are going to be reunified with a relative, that's the key phrase here, reunified with a relative, then they can get off the wait list. And again, how do you establish that? I think the way you establish that is, again, letters by the guardian ad litem, letters by the community-based care agency, the judicial reports, reviews. You know, again, it has to be realistic. So this is not any type of gaming type thing. It has to be realistic that the child really is going to be reunified with the relative, and it's getting close to or is at the finalization stage. So we're at the finalization stage. Next group. And as I said, this really is good for kids in the foster care system because we have all these different populations can now get off the wait list. So another group is transitioning to finalization for permanency with a relative. So again, not adoption, not reunification, but they're going to finalization as to permanent. They're getting permanency. They're going to be placed in a permanent status with a relative. So a permanent relative placement. Those children, again, can get off the wait list. Next group is kids who are transitioning to finalization who are going to be, they are going to get permanency through guardianship, guardianship by a non-relative. So those are the four really basic ways to capture children who are on the wait list and to determine if any of your children can realistically argue that they're transitioning to finalization for adoption, reunification, permanency with a relative, or guardianship with a non-relative. If you do, we're going to talk in a minute, you can get that child out this year. So you can't kind of wait too long because a year goes by quickly, and this appropriation method is only good for 1 year. And we don't know if next year the legislature is going to be able to provide another $16 million to get people off the wait list. We don't know what's going to happen next session. No one does. Okay? So here's the 4 ways. But as I said earlier, great opportunity because it gets better. Here it goes. There's more ways of getting the kids off the wait list through the proviso language. Now, you have a whole nother group of kids. And traditionally we call these children, these are kids who are aging out. That was the phrase we used to use all the time. Aging out of the foster care system. And so at the age of 18, they would age out. They would leave the foster care system. And what we knew, that was terrible. We knew that 40 to 60% would become homeless. Bad things happened to children when they were aging out and on their own. And so what's happened, we have created, the legislature, extended foster care. I need to get another one here too. Extended foster care. And that's Florida Statutes 39.625.51. Okay. Extended foster care. Florida Statutes 39.625.1. And what extended foster care is, and then again, the Guardian Ad Litem program, Ellen Abramowitz, and needs to get, and also the Children's First needs to get complimented for making this happen. It's a program that allows a child who is aging out 18 years old to stay in the foster care system until the age of 21. Until the age of 21. And then there is a provision for children who are have a serious disability to be in there until 22. So now what happens is that children can stay in the foster care system to the age of 21. So now you have, so how does that apply to us? Well, here it goes. Again, using the proviso language, the Appropriation Act, it says that all children who are in extended foster care, so that's you have to be in extended foster care, can get off the wait list if they need habilitation services. So that is going to open the door for many children who are on the wait list. They can get off the wait list because they're on extended foster care. So that's going to open the door for many of those children to finally get the habilitation services. Now, they need, one of the requirements, they have to show they need habilitation services. In my opinion, they've already shown it, because they're on the wait list. You don't get on the wait list if you don't need habilitation services, right? So I think they've already shown that. So really, again, what do you need to show? You're going to need to have a judicial review. You're going to need to have documentation to establish that the child is a DCF child, and two, the child's in extended foster care. Now, as I said, it even gets better. Another group of kids. These are the kids, and I've had many of these children, not many, I've had some of these children, I shouldn't qualify that, who've had it with DCF, who throw their hands up. They don't want to be in the foster care system anymore. They don't want anything to do with community-based care agencies. They don't want anything to do with the state, or as they call it, the man. They want the man off their back, right? I've had those kids. They want the man off their back. So even though this is a great program, extended foster care, and Alan Bromwitz and Children's First need to get a lot of compliments for pulling this off, this great program here. There are the children who don't want it. It means no. That's my no sign. They opt out of extended foster care. The Appropriation Act, it provides a language specifically addresses that population. And it says that that population can get off the wait list. So either you're on, if you're a foster care child, either on extended foster care or you opt out of extended foster care. Either way, you can get off the wait list if you need habilitation services. And the fact of the matter is, you wouldn't be on the wait list if you didn't need if you did not need habilitation services. So let me now talk about. So these are the, I think, 6 different ways for foster care children. Here's the 6 different ways for foster care children, and then earlier we talked about the crisis being another method of getting a child off the wait list. But how do you do this practically? How does an advocate practically get a kid off the wait list based on one of these 6 categories? Well, because this is an Appropriation Act, and because this proviso, it is not clear what the one method or one way of doing it is. So my recommendation, the way I do it at least, I think there's probably 2 different ways of doing this practically. One is DCF, Department of Children and Family Services, has what's called an APD liaison, and I'll be able to give you the liaison's contact. And what you do is you create a packet a binder that establishes that the child is transitioning to finalization for adoption. So like on this one, you'd want your home study, would be in the part of the packet. You want a letter from DCF or a letter from community-based agency and also from the guardian ad litem to establish any of these. You create all your documentation. Also on the adoption, you have a letter from the parents who are adopting. The adoptive parents can write a letter in support, saying that they're finalizing the adoption. So you get your documentation, and you send a cover letter to the liaison, and I do it electronically, to the DCF liaison, to Agency for Persons with Disabilities. I always make sure to have the full name of the child, the date of birth, the social security number, and the address of the child, so it makes it really easy. And then I have attached all these documentation, and I make my request that based on the proviso language, the child should be, as the exact language is, shall be offered a slot. That's what the legislature said, shall be offered a slot. And so that's what needs to happen if you're using the appropriation language to get the child out of the wait list. Another way, though, is not going to, so when the DCF liaison person receives your packet, they review it, and then if it has merit, they then submit it to the APD, Agency for Persons with Disabilities, liaison with DCF, and then shortly thereafter, as a matter of fact, for me, it's been very fast. Within a week, I find out whether or not usually the child is off the wait list. So it happens very fast this way. Another way would be is you create your packet and you submit it to the local APD office. Again, because it's an appropriation bill act, it's not clear which is the best way or the formal way of submitting your application. Okay, so now we talked about how to do the packets. We talked about how to get off the wait list, so let me just kind of summarize it for you. One way of getting off the wait list is through the statutory way, through crisis. You have to prove that you're homeless, danger to yourself or others, no available caretaker, and submit a package to the local APD office. And then you lose, you do administrative hearings on that issue. The other way is through the proviso language, or it's called, I also call the appropriation bill. And through the appropriation bill, then there's these really 6 different ways you can get a foster care child out of the wait list. And so these are the ways, and what needs to happen is like there's a time frame. This is not one of those things we can dilly-dally on. This is no dilly-dallying here, because it has to be done within the 1 year, because we do not know what our budget's going to look like in the state the following year. Okay, so our next conversation is going to be, in the 4th part of this 4-part series, is going to be, okay, now you have the Medicaid waiver, how do you actually get the services? And we'll talk about that in iBudget next. Thank you.